Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third installment of the Global Environmental Law Center webinar. We are following on 2 weeks of interesting discussions about climate change and then agriculture and emissions reductions, moving on to animal law and animal welfare. And today, just rethinking environmental law through storytelling. I will speak more about that in a minute, but it is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to the speaker that we have today, Professor Michelle Lim. Michelle is a fellow colleague of mine. I've known her for a while. She is also an associate professor in law at the Yong Pang Hao, I hope I've said that correctly, School of Law in Singapore Management University. Her interdisciplinary scholarship occurs at the intersection between biodiversity conservation and sustainable livelihoods. Her work focuses on future-orientated biodiversity law research aimed at advancing equity and sustainability under conditions of unprecedented environmental change. She is increasingly interested in the approaches which allows for effective engagement with scholarship and explores ways which challenge and form the scholarship, including through creative and imaginative means of expression. Michelle is also associated to the Global Environmental Law Center, so we are really excited to have her here today. And earlier in the year in Australia, I did listen to, I think, a similar presentation, Michelle, looking at shaping environmental law through storytelling. So I'm really excited to hear about this today again. I want to ask just general housekeeping that everyone is welcome to post questions in the chat, in the Q&A or in the chat. Questions will be held to the end of the presentation. And that is it for now. I'm going to give over to Michelle. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Thanks so much, Angela. It's such a joy to be here and also to see all the work you've done with the center. And thank you to everyone who's taken the time to be here today as well. So I thought I'd start our discussion with something Anagria wrote 10 years ago in the editorial, and fittingly in the editorial of the special issue in the Journal of Human Rights and the Environment, the one which commemorates what was then 40 years since Christopher Stone's Should Trees Have Standing. And Anna writes, nothing could be more urgent than the quest for worlds other than the unsustainable status quo. In this beautiful piece, she also speaks of the important project of exploring how we 21st century humans can interrogate, reimagine, and reconstitute our relationships with the complex, multiple, dynamic ecologies of which we are but a part. When talking about reimagining, many of you will also be familiar with Frederick Jameson's quote that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. In his 1994 book, The Seeds of Time, Jameson states, it seems to be easier for us today to imagine the thoroughgoing deterioration of the earth and of nature than the breakdown of late capitalism. Perhaps that is due to some weakness in our imaginations, end quote. Perhaps. Perhaps it's also because the processes of global change, of ecological destruction, of structural inequity within and between regions and countries, perhaps because all of this needs no imagination. We are living it. It's unfolding before our very eyes. Nevertheless, thinking of all that we've talked about so far, thinking about that together, number one, we desperately and urgently need to shift course from current trajectories of global change. Number two, imagination, whatever that means, and we'll discuss what that means in a little bit. Imagination is, will be, needs to be, must be central to the shifting course. And number three, it's not going to be easy. But in many ways, that brings us back full circle to number one, there's the need for urgent transformative change, and two, imagination's going to help us get there. Which brings me to our topic today, reimagining the laws of nature, storying the rules of hyperconnected futures. What I'm going to be talking about is my current thinking around a book I'm working on. And the book looks to interrogate the form of legal scholarship to explore the possibilities of thriving multi-species futures. So yes, early days, so very grateful to Angela for this platform to explore these ideas, and really looking forward to all of your comments on this work. In the next little bit, I'm going to walk you through an outline of the what, when, where, how, and also the who of our discussion today. I'll next expand on each of these. And if you're very, very good and bring your listening ears, I'll spend most of the second half of our chat practicing the maxim, show, don't tell. In other words, I'll read you a piece of multi-species speculative fiction about the most wonderful being, Mermi, the numbat, to demonstrate fiction or creative writing as legal method. So the what, sort of alluded to that already. The what's very much about imagining a range of possible multi-species future. I'll talk a little bit about how I got to this point, highlight why hopeful futures are so important, explain the S, the plural of futures, and briefly discuss legal imagination and articulate why it's so important to also bring emotion into this discussion. The when and the where are pretty straightforward. The where, in many ways, the everywhere, the hyper-connected nature of our globalized world. The when we've also already talked about. Yes, we're talking about the future, but we're also talking about the now, what needs to happen now, but also interlinked with how we got to the now, linking past, present, and future. Why? I'll talk a bit about the why of this work and why I think it's needed. But in some ways, I don't really need to, do I? We know why we need to think beyond current dominant forms, dominant structures, beyond the status quo. The now is untenable. But also the inroads and the capacity of creative writing is, of course, also the how of our discussions. And the how is the creative writing component that makes up most of what I'll be talking about. The who is also really key to all of this. And the who involves which human voices get to articulate the future, which more than human voices. And then think about, well, where do I fit in all of this? So as you'll see, at times the distinction between what, when, where, how, and who are sometimes arbitrary distinctions, and each of these necessarily mesh into each other. And we'll go into that in a little bit, but now, having patiently listened to this outline, you might be left with a further what question. That is, this all sounds very interesting, Michelle, but what does it have to do with law? And my answer to that is nothing. Nothing and everything. Nothing if your expectation is a detailed discussion of what the law is. In other words, this approach includes some doctrinal legal scholarship and some thinking about the limitations of existing law. I'm not saying we should do away with traditional doctrinal scholarship, but only that it's not a key focus of this work, and that we can't doctrinal our way out of global environmental change. Then when I say this has everything to do with law, that's because law is ultimately about developing collectively endorsed behaviors. So how can we develop the norms and structures that enable thriving multi-species worlds into infinity and beyond? It's about identifying the underlying value change that's needed to bring legal change. It's not about wishful thinking, but rather exploring legal possibility on a planet in a time of unprecedented global upheaval. So let's explore each of these questions in a little bit more detail. The what. As I alluded to earlier, I'll be exploring how I come to imagination, a little bit of discussion of how this links into the field of legal imagination, and importantly, the importance of bringing emotion into this discussion. So my first interaction with futures studies, and the S in futures is important. We're not talking about predicting a particular future, but rather, importantly, exploring future possibilities, that a range of possible futures are out there. The future is not fixed. That's a key part of future studies and why the plural is important. So quite a few years ago now, during my postdoc, I was involved with this multi-country, multidisciplinary, what they call a consortium project, where there was a lot of biophysical modeling involved, but also looking at what's known as the SSPs. So these are scenarios, socioeconomic, the acronym stands for socioeconomic pathways. What they are is a range of scenarios which aren't looking at the nuts and bolts of what amount of carbon will lead to a model of what amount of warming, but instead going, well, what's the socio-political possibilities and how that's going to inform and influence the capacity for adaptation and mitigation, depending on what type of socio-political world we could end up living in. So from that went into developing that as part of narratives and scenarios in the classroom. And then it emerged into exploring futures through narratives. And at the same time, and at first, it wasn't even this structured way, this planned way of, oh, I'm going to be looking at narratives, I'm going to be looking at futures. But I then was serendipitously asked to write a piece about the South China Sea and my experience as a kid in the South China Sea, and how my own lived experience informed thinking about what peace meant and what futures meant in that context. And then I was also really fortunate to work with Professor Anne Polina and Donna Bagnall and they led the scholarship which had the river as the first author of the paper. So very much engaging with First Nations and Indigenous ontologies, and the river had written the first part of that paper. And that then developed to a lot of what I'm talking about now in terms of using creative writing and fiction to think about what can be possible for law. So the way I come to imagination is in the very literal way of creative writing and imagining possible futures. And again, the focus on the possible is very important. We don't need to imagine the impacts of global ecological destruction, of inequity. We're living it. But at the same time, understandably, you see so many people that are resigned to a fate based on current trajectories. That is of a worse and worse and worse future for all of Earth's inhabitants, resulting inevitably, if you follow that logic, in annihilation and collapse. Is that a possible future? Of course it is. It's the course we are on, but it's but one possibility. And that's where imagination comes in. It allows us to dream possible futures. The IPBES global assessment, the IPCC reports, a range of global synthesis of the literature all conclude that it remains possible to get to thriving futures for humans and for the non-human. But to get there, there's this need for transformative change. And also, what's also needed is the need to retain our capacities to imagine what transformative change can look like. So I'm also heavily influenced by the work of Elena Bennett, who demonstrates that humans change their behavior based on what they believe is possible. And that's why the doomsday scenarios are often unhelpful, because they can lead to self-fulfilling prophecies. That is, there's a need to continue to think about what's possible. At the same time, there's the need to also think about the possible along with radical transformation of society and not technology. You see so much discussion about, look, we can just keep doing what we're doing because, yeah, eventually we'll get some technological fix to do that. You see that in terms of, dimming the sun, a lot of climate-related technologies as well. And I've always been skeptical of AI, of technology, as a means, the only means, not to say technology won't be important, but as what I find I'm skeptical of is the focus on technology as the only means for digging ourselves out of this hole. And just this week, I came across a paper by Sun-Ha Hong. It's called Predictions Without Futures, and it's just been published in History and Theory. There's a really fantastic quote from that paper, and I want to read it to you now. And it says, even though technological futures rarely ever deliver on their promises, they still remain highly persuasive. That's because it was never really about foretelling the future. It's more about borrowing legitimacy from an imagined future to justify and fund present projects. So on that note, I'll quickly move to the area of legal imagination. To some of you, you might be very familiar with it, including James Boyd White's 1973 book, literally called Legal Imagination. And it's from that book that the whole area of law and literature scholarship is generally attributed to. Some of you might be very familiar with it, but it's not something that it's something I've only recently come to, having come at imagination and being a legal scholar, coming at it that way. And it's really interesting to now look at and starting to look at that work around law and literature, and White's work as well. And he's urging to read legal instruments, legal arguments and concepts alongside literature. What's also really cool is that urging to move beyond the way in which lawyers tend to approach words, right? We like to be really explicit in defining this word means X, and therefore determining what exactly that word means. But White's work, and a lot of work that has followed from it, encourages approaches to law as if it is literature, facilitating our thinking about words and exploring and appreciating the ambiguity that comes from words. So if I were to summarize the similarities and differences, I suppose, between the current scholarship on legal imagination and what I'm attempting to do here, it seems to me that legal imagination is very much the urging for lawyers to read literature and to think about possibilities within law, and a little bit about what's beyond law. The main thing I'm urging us as lawyers to do here is to think about what's possible beyond law. What would it be like if current legal structures weren't there? What might a new system of law look like if non-humans were not only subjects of law, but if they had the capacity to, or were laws framed in a way in which non-humans could adjudicate for law? So to paraphrase James Boyd White, my hopes and expectations are not of lawyers reading imaginative literature, but rather the urging of of us to engage with writing imaginative literature. And to fully explore what's possible, I argue that we also need to engage with emotion. And Claire Minogue is a historian and a wonderful former colleague at Macquarie University, and she wrote this beautiful book called Scholastic Affect: Gender, Maternity, and the History of Emotions. And in it, she highlights how Western scholarship and scholarly writing as well, how it reinforces and centers the caricature of the scholar as the white male. And in this caricature, you have the white male who's naturally rational, and in this naturally rational mind forms an objective and therefore true vision of the world. And this, of course, requires unemotional thinking and writing. But this presupposed proper way of being in the world, of being in academia, cannot be completely me. It cannot be completely any of you. And part of what I'm trying to do here is to challenge the form of existing scholarship and to bring emotion and first person into how we write in legal scholarship as well. And what I really love about Claire's book, in addition to the fascinating scholarship, is how, again, how she writes in that first person, that the reason why she writes not only about why there has been historically the lack of affect in scholarship, but also demonstrates how through her own very personal stories that we can bring emotion and experience and so much more of ourselves to our writing and to our thinking. Which brings us to the where. Where does this occur? As alluded to earlier, it's the everywhere. A lay term would probably refer to the idea of a hyperconnected world. There's also the other word, telecoupling, which some of you have heard of. Tele, as the name suggests, across long distances, coupling, referring to social and ecological systems being so tightly intertwined that they can't be teased apart. So on the one hand, we've got a sense of a hyperconnected world. We kind of know the different components of telecoupling. Globalization, we're all familiar with the interconnected nature of global economic and social systems. We're also pretty familiar with the idea of teleconnection, even if we might not be that familiar with the term. That is the interconnected nature of global ecological systems, such as the oceans, such as the climate. What telecoupling suggests is that it makes no sense in our current interconnected world to think about globalization and teleconnection separately, that socio-ecological systems are hyperconnected right across the world because of the transfer of goods, transfer of finance, transfer of knowledge due to the rise of the internet. And in many ways, it's about this really complex system that reverberates right around the world. So particularly in biodiversity, you're seeing the impacts of biodiversity loss occurring far, far away from where the activities occurred and arising as a result of the exchange of financial and economic and social systems, consumer choices, etc., etc. So coming back to creative writing and fiction, in many ways, this is helpful in this systems thinking of where the connections are, because in world making that comes with fiction, there's this need to link coherence across multiple narrative arcs, characters, etc., etc. So it can also, while our hyperconnected world is also the background which all this work occurs, it's also a helpful way to tease out where those connections are. Similarly, with the when, this idea of futures, creative writing can help us link coherence not only across space, but also across time. Coming now back to the why. Why do this work? As I highlighted earlier, in some ways, we know why, but to draw on some of the issues I discussed in a paper in the Journal of Environment, a short paper in the Journal of Environmental Law called Fiction as Legal Method, I highlight how the Anthropocene has been called the Great Homogenization. So there's few countries on this earth where you walk down the street and you don't see someone in a t-shirt. So this fashion item is something that you can see almost everywhere across the world. Coca-Cola is never far from reach. So Jarius Grove argues that the homogenization of our planet limits the social technical horizons of human and more than human worlds. He goes on to describe how the geopolitical advance of homogenization is killing futures as it strangles the present. So in our hyperconnected but intellectually colonized world, this drives homogenization at a time when we're most in need of novel ideas, radical imaginations, and revolutionary imaginaries. And not only do we need radical imagination, in that piece, I also call for relational imagining. That is imagining with the more than human. And I draw on the work of Emily Bullitt and Joshua Sterling, who highlight that environmental law remains in a one world paradigm. So that is where human use of the environment is about determining how much harm should be allowed rather than what sort of obligations and relationships are required with more than human nature. So if environmental law scholarship is going to remain useful given the novel implications of our hyperconnected world and global environmental change, we need more expansive and inclusive paradigms. And therefore, this brings me to the how. So, you know, the answer to what the how is, it's creative writing and storytelling. We're talking about that already. So part of what I'll be talking about in the how is really in some ways an extension of the why this how is needed. So the necessary first step is dreaming the possible, right? And asking if current instruments and institutions can get us to the world's other. And if they don't, the next question is, well, what should take their place? Sophie Chow and Dion Inari in this wonderful piece called Decolonizing Climate Change, More Than Human Imaginaries, only just came out last year. They argue that stories help us believe in, but also achieve these better shared worlds. And they go on to explain how more than human fiction can challenge us to think about who the subjects of our work are, who they need to include. And that, quote, storing extinction, loss, and crisis, in doing so, we're reminded of our obligations to beyond human worlds. And you can see what this means for law. So similar to Christopher Stone's question of whether trees should have standing, since then, rivers, mountains have in jurisdictions around the world been recognized with legal personhood. And we need greater imagination around not only who the subjects of law can and must be, but also what agency needs in the non-human. And at the same time, of what responsibilities and how we extend responsibilities to the non-human. There's something else I really like about the potential of the changing the form, of using the form of creative writing. That is its subversive quality. Because to get to the possible, we really need to disrupt the status quo. Roana Gonçalves, in a 2021 paper, Interrupting Intersectionality, speaks about creative writing in ways that echo those of James Boyd White. That is, she talks about how creative writing complicates fixed ideas She emphasizes that the process of writing creatively creates possibilities for deconstructing that which has been socially constructed. And at the same time, Siri Velen and others in a 2018 paper about transformative storytelling talk about how writing fiction can allow us to be the protagonists of our own stories as we navigate novelty and complexity in the Anthropocene. Which brings us to the who. And I think the who of who gets to imagine these cultures, who gets to imagine the future, is really important, because we need to move beyond the current hegemonic culture and ways of thinking and knowing. We need diverse ways, means, peoples in order to dream the range of possibilities for all that inhabit our planet. And this is where the work of, and I'm going to read to you from this paper by Tao Lee Goff, really speaks to me. And it's a paper called Stolen Life, Stolen Time, Black Temporality, Speculation, and Racial Capitalism. And as you can see, I've kind of highlighted all the way through, and I'll choose a few parts to read to you. In particular, this, when talking about speculative fiction and the way it's been done. So what Goff highlights is how the avoidance of race in most sci-fi and speculative fiction genres that often stage the future, the avoidance of race is not a neutral act. She goes on to say how ignoring the future color line reinforces white supremacy, because avoiding race does not solve racism. And the chilling next sentence of the limited, how she writes, how the limited capacity to imagine people of color in the future always has ethical underpinnings regarding genocide and who will exist in the future. She also speaks about how Asians, if present in speculative fiction, are often depicted as technologically advanced and intellectually primitive. So really important to think about who is in the future, but also who gets to define the future. And I'd now like to take you to another piece, which I'd be very happy to just read to you all, Dave. I've picked out a few choice quotes, and this is actually a piece by a few of my friends. So Lara Pereira, Odirilwe Selemane, Nadia Sitas, Rita Sitas, all South African scholars. And they've written this wonderful piece called Wakanda Fambili. And it's this interdisciplinary group of scholars engaged, so a lot of them from a scientific background, but engaging with what African science fiction means for reimagining the Anthropocene. And similar to Goff, their opening line is that Africa is absent from the future. In almost every future, they write dystopian or utopian, there's a continent-sized hole in the story. And the next quotable, so many quotable quotes, but the next quotable quote I'd like to highlight is how they state that the denial of equity in time is connected to a denial of equity in space. And importantly, they go on to highlight how movies such as Black Panther, which depicts parts of Africa as advanced civilization, how that has smashed many box office records. This demonstrates that the world is hungry for different narratives of African futures, and how they next talk about how decision-making in an era of sustainable development requires transformative ways of seeing the future, ways that disrupt the status quo. They emphasize that dominant theories have generally been inadequate in helping us interrogate current global trends. And another key sentence that I'd like to draw out here is how they cite Akili Mbeve and Sarah Nuttall, who state that it's critically important not only to write Africa into the world, but also to write the world from Africa. And I'm also very much taken by the writing of Michaela Saunders, who's a Darug and Lebanese author who's brought together this the first anthology of Indigenous science fiction from Indigenous peoples from the continent now known as Australia. And she writes about what Indigenous people bring to thinking about the futures, and states that there are so many speculative fiction themes that are just stone cold reality for us right now, right across this continent. We are post-apocalyptic and yet not post-colonial. So all those violent histories of invasion and colonization must be read as apocalyptic by any standard. And she goes on to talk about how speculative fiction as a Western genre employs devices that our, as in Indigenous Australians, cultural stories have dealt with for millennia. For example, time travel isn't such a big deal when you belong to a culture that experiences all times simultaneously, not in a progressive straight line like Western cultures do. So where does this leave me? Someone of mixed heritage, of Chinese, Hakka, Teochew on my dad's side, of colonizer heritage on the Australian side, Scottish, English, all sorts of, I think Cornish, and apparently there's a French pirate in there, according to my great auntie. But anyhow, where does that leave me in thinking about how I engage with what's possible for the future, who needs to be in the future? And I think I can, of course, tell no story but my own, and that I need to bring my own story and to consciously consider who's included or not within worlds of fiction, that I need to acknowledge where ideas come from, but also to importantly cite, elevate, and engage with authors that hold beyond status quo lived experiences and personal and generational histories. So on that note, this year I wrote some slam poetry titled Out of Time. In it, I explore ideas of accelerated history, accelerated time. Riffing on the idea of a grandfather's clock, I engage with my memory of my grandmother's clock, and that clock's still there in my childhood home. I think some of you have already heard me perform that one, so I won't do that now. Instead, as promised, and you've done so well with your listening ears, so as this last part of our discussion, I want to read you a Numbat story from the Endling novella I somehow managed to sneak into a law journal. So when I say endling novella, an endling is the last of its kind, a last remaining individual of a plant and animal species. And within that journal article, the piece ended up being similar to that of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. That is, it had Australian endlings, past, recent, and yet to come. The past endling was the Tasmanian tiger. The recent endling was an Elvis impersonating lizard called Gump, the final Christmas Island forest skink. And Gump is the name of the last known Christmas Island forest skink. She died on the 31st of May, 2014. And the stories I'm about to read you come from the 1st of January, 2050. They're two alternate stories of Mermi, the Numbat, who could be the final Numbat, the last of the species. So for those of you who don't know what a Numbat looks like, I've got my Numbat earrings on today, but probably a better idea to just Google Numbat, N-U-M-B-A-T. And there's this super cute marsupial about this high, bushy tail, super long tongue because they eat termites. And similar to Dickens' Christmas Carol, there's this character called Nature's Ghost that takes this other character, live human, traveling through time and space to meet each of these endlings. And Ghost has already taken human to meet Muru, the Tasmanian tiger, and the Christmas Island forest skink. And we meet with them just as they're about to go to the year 2050 and to try and see Mermi, the number. So here we go. Whoa, the heat. Human executes an involuntary squint and head shake. It is late in the day, but the mercury remains high. The hot air assaults human skin. Have we walked into an oven? That's smoke. Where are we, Ghost? Asks human, blinking. This place looks unfamiliar. This is the future, live human, Ghost declares. It's New Year's Day, 2050. See that? That's the innovation incubator. Let's head inside. The entire facility is thermoregulated. And if this was a movie, what would come across your screen right now would be the words Mermi, the last number. 1 January 2050, Perth Innovation Incubator, Wajak Nunga Buja. Human follows Ghost to the side of the facility. Ghost beams the two travelers into the incubator. No more night fever, murmurs Ghost contentedly. Feeling a bit better now, human? What do you reckon about this tech? Look around. Almost every species you could imagine. Look at this riot of life staying alive. Staying alive, staying alive. Staying alive. Very nice, Ghost. Thanks. Ghost smiles proudly. Staying alive? For what purpose, Ghost? Wonders human. Reintroduction programs? Ghost sighs. Human, have you already forgotten what we walked in from? Oh. Just a few steps more. Ghost reassures human. Through the tree museum, something catches human's eye. Don't mind, Ghost, human asks politely. Can we stop here for a little bit? At the number room. Oh, is this a juvenile? Judge her by her size, do you? Ghost questions human. Mermi is a full-grown adult number. Oh, they're so much smaller than I imagined, squeals human, enamored by the little ant-eating marsupial. Live human, says Ghost gravely. There's no more they. What do you mean, Ghost? Mermi is who we have come to see, explains Ghost. Mermi? Mermi is an endling, utters human. A mixture of question, exclamation, and despair. Ghost nods. How can this be, Ghost? Cries human. It's 2050, yeah? What about the 2050 vision of the Convention on Biological Diversity? Isn't 2050 when we would be living in harmony with nature? Okay, I know the vision is vague, aspirational spin, not backed up by concrete commitments from governments, but the Convention's post-2020 framework, it didn't help. Human, should I be touched by your faith in regulatory instruments hell-bent on maintaining the status quo? Ghost responds impatiently. Have Muru and Gump not provided some insight to the impotence of business as usual approach of existing law? Ah, human appreciates Ghost's point. Yes, Ghost, I suppose I shouldn't ask about where the 2020 review of the EPBC Act ended up, but wasn't there a NUMBAT monitoring program? Monitoring, huh? Ghost starts to wonder if humans learned anything at all from their travels. He should have asked Gump how monitoring turned out for the Christmas Island bats. There was monitoring, all right. What about the NUMBAT feral predator proof reserves? Weren't they getting somewhere? Yes, they were, but a coal seam was found under one. But coal was a dying industry, protests human. The mining project still got approval. Ghost's voice is tinged with resignation. On similar grounds, the minister approved offsetting another reserve. The environment cannot stand in the way of jobs. You know the rhetoric. It was supposed to be okay. Assessed individually, each project wasn't causing too much harm, apparently. Besides, so the logic goes, there were other reserves doing well. Then one ended up too close to urban sprawl, the fires came for another, then finally the rest went down the extinction vortex. Limited genetic diversity, disease, pests, ferals. And now, here we are. Humans' questions continue to tumble out. What about 2020 bushfires? What about COVID-19? Weren't these all supposed to be the turning points for widespread systemic change? The catalysts for re-evaluating our relationships with the rest of nature and with each other? You okay, human? Ghost asked softly, putting a hand on live human's shoulder. Should we go say hello to Mummy? No, Ghost. Human struggles to spit out words. I'm sorry, I can't. I'm sorry, Mummy, so sorry. Can we go now, Ghost? Please. So if you're reading along, and we're currently at page 633 of volume 29 of the Griffith Law Review, it's that point in which I then have a discussion about what might be possible. But in doing so, I first quote from Ebenezer Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, and the quote is, "What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." And I then ask, what reason do we have for hope in this extinction-prone world? And then I go on to list the range of reasons for hope, the possibilities from around the world, how it's been demonstrated that where nature has come back from the brink, where extinction, where species thought extinct have been brought back. And if I was writing this now, I would also include the example of the hornbill in Singapore, locally extinct and then gradually brought back. Otters are coming back as well. And my dean was telling me about how monkeys in Singapore, there was a monkey that got into a house as well. So when nature is restored, there's all these possibilities to bring it back. Nature is resilient, but it has its limits. And then I go on to say how if we are to move beyond the current extinction trajectory, we need to see the enormity and scale of biodiversity loss and our role within it. We need to recognize that while extinction may be irreversible, in the words of Winfield et al., it's not inevitable, and neither should it be acceptable. we need to be asking how we harness the power of this moment towards efforts that move far beyond palliative care for final members of species. And this requires drawing links not only to care for final individuals, but for species as a whole, and not even only for the wider habitats, ecosystems they inhabit. But importantly and difficultly, it requires us to confront chains of causation between loss of species and how we live our lives. And I then go on to talk about how storying endlings past, recent, and possible future, this helps us to think beyond, to get and to imagine those possible desirable futures. And in the piece itself, I'm running out of time, so I won't take you through the whole piece itself. There's a next part which imagines another possible future for Mermi, the number. And in this last final bit, I'll read you the final bit of the conversation between Mermi and human. So the story that has unraveled here, again, Ghost has taken human to 2050. It's still hot, but not so hot. Human is able to hear the music that's being made by trees, and not only does first human meets Mermi's great-great-grandchildren, Fassi and Kobe, and eventually has this conversation with Mermi. And I'll read this last bit here, where Mermi asks, human asks Mermi, Mermi, yes, human, what changed? What put our world on a different path? That, human, is a question for you, not for me. The time before you is your own to make amends in. What then do I bring back with me in time? Bring what you want, human, responds Mermi nonchalantly. She pauses, then continues forcefully. But do not bring fear. Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. Bring bravery, bring hope, bring every last centimeter of your being. Bring your brain, of course. Bring your eyes, your ears, but most importantly, bring your heart and bring your soul. I'll try, Mermi, promises human. Mermi places her paws on human's collarbone and looks human straight in the eyes. Do or do not, human. There is no try. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. As always, so thought-provoking. And I really want to say trailblazing. I think that you're kicking this off, and people are going to start to catch on, and hopefully more and more academics and lawyers are going to start to catch on. And I'm excited to see how this field develops. Everyone is welcome to post questions in the chat or in the Q&A. And then while people do that, I might start, hijack the opportunity to start. So while you were talking, two things came to mind. The first being a comment someone made at our previous webinar when we were talking about animal welfare and rights of nature. And she made the comment saying that while in different cultures, you do live forever. And that links to what you were saying about time travel, because maybe now you will be in human form, but you could come back as an animal. And that is quite interesting, not only if we think then about animal welfare and rights of nature, because then there's some human, interest there if we say, but I can come back in the next life as an animal. I'm wondering if and how you think that impacts storytelling, or if it should, or if it does. And then the second question I was thinking about are the Indigenous communities or First Nations communities in Australia. And of course, we have our own Indigenous communities in South Africa with our own context. But something that is a beautiful term and principle to me is the sort of principle of Ubuntu. I'm not sure if you've read about that, but it's basically means I am because we are. So it's about, communities looking after one another. And it's about that recognition of the interrelationship between humans and families. But I also think, importantly, up to the environment. If I think about the Khoisan people in our country, for example, who really look after the environment in their own ways. They've got certain practices that they've passed, down for generations. And I think that even that is a form of storytelling, that practice between the communities, although, maybe they're not telling each other their story, but they're telling the story by doing. And yeah, I was just wondering what you think about that. Is there something similar in Australia? I'm not sure. And if you can comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, great questions. And in many ways, they're interrelated to each other, right? So part of what I'm hearing in those questions is this being open to the plurality of values and ways of seeing the world that are more attuned to responsibilities to nature. So working with Professor Ampolina, and again, recognizing that there are multiple nations across Australia, but a theme that comes out a lot if one were to generalize across some of the Indigenous ontologies that I've heard about is this idea of obligation. So even this idea of rights in terms of animal rights, it's something that I think is sometimes a bit jarring to that worldview, in that it's not so much about rights, but more about responsibilities and different types of responsibilities that humans and non-humans have to each other. So the relationality that in many ways you are alluding to as well, right? And I also think that this is where pluralism is so important. So I think in your two questions, you demonstrated that in terms of how different cultures and ways of looking at the world provide a range of possibly much more sustainable ways of looking to the future and engaging for a planet that's livable in the next even 20, 30, 50, thousands and thousands of years from now. And that also relates in many ways, I think, to one of the key messages that's come out from the very new IPBES global assessment. And actually, I think I've got it here. Yes. And one of the key messages there is how the value of the instrumental use of nature that's been so prioritized, and in current systems where nature's values, which can be traded in markets, how because that's been prioritized, this is an important driver of global decline of biodiversity and the unsustainable use of nature. So a lot of what the values assessment talks about is enhancing this idea of relational values. And I think in many ways, the examples you use highlight both of that. So it's not just humans' obligations to non-humans, but also the obligations humans have to each other, those human-to-human relationships, creating those social norms around interacting and protecting and sustaining nature in ways in which, the dominant neoliberal capitalist systems are about the opposite, the extraction of nature and how we can make money from it.
Yes, thank you. I completely agree with you. And I think there are so many interesting routes that we can take this. If you think about just the diversity in cultures and storytelling, and I think this is going to open so many new pathways for law and governance and thinking about law and governance. And I think one of your sentences were rethinking law. I might now completely misphrase you, but doing away with legal structures. I think that was what you said. And I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit more what you mean by doing away with legal structures, but we still have law and we want to rethink it. Just how you see that relationship. I see there are questions, so I'm going to let you answer that, and then I'm going to go into the chat and read the questions.
So I'm reminded of this project led by Nicole Rogers and Michelle Maloney that I'm just so fortunate to be invited to contribute a chapter to, and they've done this wonderful project of not just saying, oh, let's do an edited collection, but this staged approach of workshops, bringing people together to, in many ways, rethink the common law for the Anthropocene. So they brought in speculative fiction writers, they brought in people from the IPCC to talk about, you know, the SSPs I was talking about, the shared scenarios of what the future could look like. And there's also been, so it's essentially, I think, trying to remember the correct name, the Anthropocene Judgments Project. So what would judgments look like if they were written with the Anthropocene in mind? And in writing my piece, I'm very much inspired by work that Professor Irene Watson did in a similar judgment rewriting project. So Irene Watson is this leading Indigenous scholar who is one of the leading people bringing that link between what Indigenous law is and, I suppose, helping us to understand what that is. And in work that she did, she essentially said, well, I can't rewrite this judgment being part of this colonial form of the common law. So essentially rewrote it from the beginning. And I, of course, don't pretend that I can do anything like that, but I really am inspired by this idea of, well, let's not just tinker with the law. Let's not just tinker with a judgment to go, oh yeah, I might change this slightly. Let's ask questions about what if we were to start from scratch in terms of not only non-humans as subjects of law. I mean, they are already, that's great, unimaginable when Christopher Stone was writing, perhaps. But not only non-human as subjects of law, but what would it mean if they were the judges themselves? What sort of forums would we need to have where non-humans could be adjudicators of law and not just petitioners or the subjects of law? So I suppose thinking outside current, common law systems or current legal systems generally, to go, well, what sort of different fora would be needed to truly give effect to some of the things that we imagine we need, or the possibilities that we hope for.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. It also makes me think about other discussions on Earth system law, for example. Louis Coetzee is doing a lot of work on that and wondering, how storytelling might fit in that context. But that's talking about structures in a different way altogether. I'm going to move to the Q and answer. So first we have a comment from Peter Cantor, who says, inspirational. Thank you for your wonderful concepts and language tools. Your beautiful story helps me feel the imagined loss of extinction and opens the mind to look away to avoid it. I love your use of positive aspects or affects of play, seeking, and caring. Disney, Netflix, and the like, take note. That is great. Peter is one of the formidable environmental lawyers in South Africa. So I think that's such a great comment. Then Peter also asks a question. So he asks, my question is, how does legal doctrine get from here to there? Can you imagine ways of change other than the usual? For example, litigation, legislation, and treaties to move us to culture shifts?
Yeah, and that's a really, really good question, because that's the difficult part of all of this, right? And something that I'm not quite there yet. I'm sort of in that process of linking to what we were just talking about, Angela, in terms of, well, what would the something else look like? I'm kind of at that path of going, well, we need to be thinking about what the something else looks like. The difficult bit of, how do we coherently link together a completely new system of law? Definitely, yes, a work in progress, but I think, and in many ways, linking back to your first questions of where we look beyond colonial structures of law, of different ways in which decision-making has been made traditionally, culturally, and therefore, again, the need to engage in plural ways about thinking about what these new structures maybe would look like.
Indeed. Thank you, Michelle. Then Ntando is one of my students, and I see he is asking, well, he's thanking you for your presentation and asking if you will share the title of the book that you were reading from. He missed it.
So let's see. It wasn't a book. It's a special issue that from the Griffith Law Review, volume 29 of the Griffith Law Review. So you should, I think, be able to get it online. I just got a hard copy of it. So it's a special issue that I was so lucky to work with Ashwin Akhtar Kavari and Katie Wollaston, which some of you I think would know well, in bringing together a special issue which was looking at environmental law's extinction problems. So yes, I encourage you to read the volume, not for my piece, but for the really interesting papers that are in there that engage with how we get beyond, what does a post-extinction world look like in law?
If anyone has more questions, you can raise your hand or comment in the chat. Michelle, I actually have another question. So I often, of course, I'm an environmental lawyer, but I often dabble in planning law and urban law, city law and governance. And I'm wondering, so we're talking now about rethinking law or rethinking environmental law and storytelling. Do you think that this approach could be applied to something like planning law, which is very sort of hard black letter law? We're dealing with zoning and land use and things like that, storytelling in that context. And then also looking at city or local government law, how cities as actors in governance, as actors in legal structures, should govern to protect nature and develop laws to protect nature and humans and that interrelationship. Have you thought of that? I find that very interesting.
Yeah, I think in many ways, even though until you asked the question, I hadn't really thought that, but in many ways, planning law is like one of the best areas for thinking about futures, right? Because like I was going to, plan means, I don't know the exact definition of plan, but it's about how do we think about the future. So in many ways, the starting point's really there within planning law, but the underlying values to me, what needs to change. And of course, I'm talking about the Australian context. I don't understand the South African context, but it appears to me that in Australian context, planning law is basically about how do we get to the yes of development. And, you know, the environmental bit is, oh, let's have a little tiny speed hump along the way. So we pretend that we've got hashtag sustainability in there. That's my sense of what planning law feels like, the underlying values. And I'm trying to remember the paper, but no, it's not coming to mind, but the argument in there is about how there's this conflict, a contradiction in terms of environment and development when it comes to the government, because the government's responsible for both environmental protection and for development, which is an inherent conflict. And definitely in the Australian context, we know what wins out every time. We pretend that we can problem shift through offsets, for example, to another area. It's just this small little area that, yeah, we might be killing a few endangered species here, but that's okay. It's not considering the cumulative whole. So in terms of storytelling, I think it can be helpful for thinking about it in a planning context. What if we had a world where planning really was for 100 years? And for example, in Bangladesh, the Bangladesh government has this 100-year plan, which the range of foresight that's involved there, I think, is phenomenal. And then, but then coming back to planning law to go, well, how do we ensure that these values of ecological integrity are not, you know, swept aside when there's the development issues as well?
I think you have phrased it so perfectly. Knowing what I know from planning that I did in my PhD is, well, planning is very technocratic. It's very blueprint orientated. And until recently, mostly planning it's rigid. It's not really flexible. It's supposed to be. On paper, it seems that way, but it's not. If a land use is zoned a specific way, it's a nightmare to rezone it to anything else, let alone to protect it for the environment. And often it is that development drives planning, and it should be the other way around. So I think planning is such a great tool, because you can think, like in South Africa and in most cities, councils 5 years into the future strategically, but then 20 years spatially. And now you've just mentioned about India, which is 100 years. That in itself, I think, brings a lot of challenges. You know, how can we predict the future 100 years from now in a rapidly evolving, rapidly changing environment with challenges like climate change? But yeah, for me at least, interesting to think about planning. There is a question in the chat from Christian Zenem. So he thanks you for the wonderful presentation and saying that it's thought-provoking. And he asks you, how do you see reimagining the future of law and the environment by deconstructing past and present to achieve these two things? So contextualizing the globalization of ecology and environment, and effective ways to communicate a reimagined environmental future to grow and enlarge the base, making it a continuous reimagination process.
Thanks, Christian. So I'm just trying to see, I've got a book. Don't know where it is. It was on my bookcase, but some of you, oh, I know where it is. It's under my computer. So I've propped it up under my computer.
Holding your screen.
So Amitav Ghosh's Nutmeg's Curse. And I think I really like the argument he weaves through there about the interlinked nature of colonialism and neoliberalism, how they reinforce each other, and therefore how and you see this also similarly in a lot of the writings by Indigenous scholars, where who talk a lot of this, not of a post-colonial world, because the impacts of colonialism are ongoing, and therefore when you talk about the link of past, present, and future, that comes to mind for me. And also, again, back to Irene Watson and how she describes the conceptualization of time as being circular. And Anne Paulina talks about this idea of the long now. And in many ways, the law that she describes, that Irene Watson describes in her book, of how law storytelling is very much a part of law, and stories are not stories, I suppose, in the way that we normally think about them, but they're a way of transmitting the law and understanding what obligations are through time and across generations. So she tells this, go and find Irene Watson's book. It's the most amazing book called Raw Law. And in it, there's this wonderful story about this greedy frog that drank too much water. And then the law that comes from that is about the balancing of power, because they go and tickle the frog, and then I think somehow the frog transforms into multiple smaller frogs, with the law essentially being about when power is concentrated in this one body, then the greedy frog will drink up all the water, but the importance of having, you know, this distributed water to avoid greediness, power, and those sorts of issues there.
I actually think I recall reading that. I remember the story about the frog, but I haven't read it in a while. It's something I'd love to share with my students. So thank you for reminding me of that. We have another question from actually the Global Environmental Law Center researcher, Dr. J.C. Ashikem. So he says, thank you for an interesting presentation. Although there is a fine line between fiction and reality, my question is, how would decolonializing colonial laws help in rethinking the place of non-humans in the environmental governance sphere? Is rethinking possible? In other words, can non-humans have a place in environmental protection?
Yeah. So to me, there's so many deep, interesting themes in that question. On the one hand, this idea of decolonizing, right? And what that means. And I would argue that's why there's a need to explore legal possibility beyond law. That's why this idea of rethinking the structures, back to the earlier discussion about this real transformation, real decolonization, necessarily cannot occur within that same structure which brought about the inequity, historical continued inequity, but also unsustainability. I'm trying to remember the rest of the question, but I think the second part of the question, I think yeah, can't remember, sorry.
Yeah, I think that was the gist of the question. Yeah, asking about the fine line between fiction and reality and how can decolonializing assist. So I think that was the gist. Thank you, Michelle. I'm wondering for myself, the book you are busy with, is this a manuscript, or is this an edited version? Monograph, sorry. Is it a monograph or an edited version?
It's a monograph, but it's still early days, working up to a proposal stage right now. Yeah.
All right. It's so interesting. I can't wait to hear about it and read it. And hopefully we will be chatting to you in the year or so to come. Years, maybe, I'm not sure, about your book.
Yeah, more like
and the
years,
book launch. Yes. Yes. But that is really, I've really enjoyed this, and I know that my students will enjoy this too. So I want to extend an invitation to you to do a guest lecture on this to my students. But you and I can talk about that after the webinar or over email.
Yeah.
It is almost time to close. So are there any further questions, or are we done for today? Does anyone have a final question or word for Michelle? Okay, it doesn't seem like that, Michelle. So we are then ending the session. Thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed this, and I know everyone here did too. I look forward to seeing your work, and you are even making me rethink planning, rethink urban governance. So that's exciting. And I think the notion of resilient law, what is resilient law or adaptive law, there's even a scope for rethinking that with storytelling, perhaps. So I think you're on the cusp of just blowing things wide open. And that is exciting. That's what we should do as academics. So thank you for sharing this with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Michelle. I am going to make this recording available, so we will send the emails out when the recording is available. And I hope you have a lovely day further there, Michelle. I'm not sure what the time is now in Singapore.
Almost 6:30.
Oh my goodness. So have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
It was wonderful having you join us, and I'll be speaking to you again soon. Thank you on behalf of the law faculty and the dean too.
Thanks so much, Angela, and thanks everyone for coming.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.